After last week's fatal shooting of 5 bank employees in Florida, only a few of the victims' names were released. That's because Florida and at least 14 other states have enacted a version of Marsy's Law, a victims' rights statute.
I'm Kelsey Grammer. My dad was gunned down at his home at the age of 38. 6 years later, my sister Karen was brutally raped and murdered. She was 18. When my father's killer was released, I found out through the National Enquirer. It seemed like a cruel joke.
Actor Kelsey Grammer is just one of many high-profile crime victims backing Marsy's Law, named after a California college student who was stalked and killed by her ex-boyfriend in 1983. The law focuses on victims' rights, like being kept in the legal loop.
Marsy's Law will require that victims be notified. They will have the right to be heard. If there's going to be a plea deal, victims will have the right to participate.
The law also requires law enforcement to ask families before releasing names of victims of crime. In Florida, the law went into effect 3 weeks before 5 women were gunned down at a bank in Sebring.
3 families asked their loved ones' names not be released, citing the new Marsy's Law. Chief only making public 2 victims' names.
Of course, media outlets can find names on their own, as Time did, profiling the 5 murdered women. The promoters of Marsy's Law, though, want to take it one step further.
God willing, the 28th Amendment of the United States Constitution will be a crime victims' bill of rights.
Not if the ACLU and others have a say in it, though, claiming the law itself is unconstitutional. Yeah, prior restraint. But you know what's really interesting about all of this? Because we discussed this last week with that documentary Detained about the murder of that little boy in London and how the family didn't want the story told. It seems that people have really decided, not all across this country anyway, that the people's privacy rights are being disrespected by the media. And it's probably true. I mean, the media will go to any length to get any detail. On the other hand, as I've always said, somebody's name in association with a crime, be it the victim or the perpetrator, is simply a point of fact. It's a point of information. And withholding points of information is really not what we're in the business of doing.
I think the reason people are skeptical of having their loved ones' names released now is because of the advent of social media. So before, where somebody's name was mentioned on television or printed in the newspaper, maybe it lasted one news cycle. But now there are all sorts of weird cyber predators and people that can do research and find out and come and find your address. And I think that makes victims and their families more private. It's certainly more of a risk for them to be exposed.
Well, but the answer to that, I don't think, lies in prior restraints on public information the media can report. I mean, look, I think this whole issue speaks to this broader problem of what the Internet era is doing to journalism, to the public image of journalism, and the perception of what good journalistic practice is. The bottom line is that reporters and editors and publishers should use good judgment and common human decency when they make case-by-case decisions about, do we identify rape victims? Some publications do, most don't, right? And that's with good reason. Again, these kind of decisions should be made by individual organizations in good faith with awareness of and respect for individuals in the community, not by the Florida state legislature.
That law is never going to happen.
Not exactly a font of wisdom.
I think part of the problem is that the public sees when there are bad decisions made, when there is exploitative coverage of tragic events. People see that, and everyone knows what that looks like. I think the people of the ACLU and other media ethics types are concerned about the use of the law in more obscure cases where law enforcement, for reasons to cover up bad behavior, bad investigative practices, discriminatory investigative practices, just various types of misconduct, will end up slow-rolling efforts by reporters to figure out what has happened in specific crime cases. And I think there is a tendency for law enforcement agencies to be very secretive about information, even when it is the law that stuff be disclosed. And so having the Florida legislature restrict that further. Florida has done one thing right in the realm of politics, which is have good public records laws, and now they're going back on that.
That's right. I take your point about the Internet and social media. I think this idea would have been just as popular 30 years ago as it is today. I think that it's always been easy to sell the public on the idea that those exploitative people in the media deserve to have their hands slapped and not get this information out. The problem here is not just the law, but it's being over-interpreted. I mean, there are cases in which the law would not seem to prevent the release of names, and yet law enforcement officials are citing the law as a reason not to release the names of victims. And in some cases, it's also been used not to release the names of police officers who've been charged with various offenses. We need to do a better job of explaining what it is we do and why, and try to get the public to understand, at least to some extent, why this is a bad idea.
This thing has grown, has momentum. It's gotten, it's in 14 states, and there's a version of it in progress in about 34 states.
But one other super quick point. The welcome progress in victims' rights that's occurred over the last few decades, notification when the scumbag who victimized you is being released, opportunity to speak, that kind of thing, none of it would have come about if it had been left to politicians. It's media coverage of the anguish of victims and of their movement for more rights that helped that become reality.
That's true.